The SU-152 and ISU-152 were, and still are, well known for their massive guns and impressive claimed capabilities against German tanks such as the Tiger and Panther. That is how they got their nickname, Zveroboy, meaning beast killer. However, that was more related to propaganda than their actual usefulness as tank destroyers. Their massive 152mm guns, while very effective if they hit the target, were rather inaccurate at long range, slow to aim and to reload, and limited in traverse by their mounting in a superstructure. These guns were not well suited for a tank destroyer. The SU-152 and ISU-152 were not, in fact, tank destroyers, but assault guns, meant to help Soviet attacks break down enemy defenses and strongpoints. Yet, for assault guns, their protection was, more often than not, quite lacking. With the start of production of the Kirovets-1, better known as the IS-3, the opportunity arose to improve the beast killers, now focusing on protection. This vehicle was to become the Object 704 or Kirovets-2. It is also called ISU-152 Model 1945 in Russian literature. However, it is likely that the Object 704 was never referred to as such in the short life it had, and could be a modern name, possibly invented at Kubinka according to Russian historian Yuri Pasholok. Welcome to a new Tank Encyclopedia voiced article. If you like our videos, please do consider supporting us on Patreon or PayPal. Those funds go towards the amazing illustrations you see accompanying each of our videos and articles. For those of you that are already subscribed and donating, thank you very much, you make this possible. Due to the problems of the ISU-152, proposals came as early as 1944 from the GABTU, the main Directorate of Armored Forces, to the SKB-2 plant to upgrade the vehicle. However, little materialized. Then work started on a new IS tank, the Kirovets-1. There were also plans to modernize the gun on the ISU-152 as well. In 1943, the GABTU artillery section stated that the 152.4mm ML-20S howitzer was not suited for use on a self-propelled gun. The issues on the ML-20 naturally reflected on the battle performance of the ISU-152. An example was the TS-AKB slotted muzzle brake, kicking up a lot of dust, almost blinding the gunner after firing, and more importantly, revealing the vehicle's position. Thus, the GABTU put out a series of requirements for the modernization of the weapon. Firstly, this included the removal of the muzzle brake, changes to the breech, and improvements to the recoil system. OKB-172 was assigned to develop the upgrade by 13th January 1944, headed by a Mr. Tsirulnikov. The new gun was to be named ML-20SM, M standing for modernized. Blueprints were ready by the 1st of March of the same year, and by the 10th of March, the prototype was built in factory number 172. The very next day, firing trials were undertaken, but after the 33rd shot, testing was halted due to poor operation of the new breech. Further tests were made through March until 14th of April, when it passed the test for rapid consecutive firing of 60 shots, which it fired in 39 minutes. While that might seem like a lot, the initial firing time estimation for them was 60 minutes, 1 round per minute. The gun averaging actually 1.5 rounds per minute. Testing was continued into May, the gun having fired a total of 249 rounds, out of which 196 were high explosive charges. The average rate of fire over the entire testing period was an impressive 2.9 rounds per minute. In fact, Chelyabinsk had started working on an SPG based on the Kirovets-1 at the beginning of 1945. It received the name Kirovets-2. The chief engineer and designer was Troyanov. A letter from Engineer Lieutenant Colonel Markin, a representative of the GABTU in Chelyabinsk, was sent to the GABTU Chief Engineer Lieutenant Colonel Blagonravov on this topic. It stated that the Kirov factory was working on a Kirovets-1 based SPG, stating its armor thickness level and other features, namely that it used the same transmission, running gear and engine as the Kirovets-1. Most interesting is that according to the letter, Work on the prototype started on the 1st of February 1945. The letter was sent on the 10th of February 1945. Chelyabinsk also announced Gurenko, chief designer of factory number 172, saying that SKB-2 was working on such a vehicle. This led the engineers from number 172 coming over to Chelyabinsk between the 14th and 20th of February. During this time, SKB-2 had sent the blueprints of the Kirovets 2 over to factory number 200 as well. Also in mid-February, the hull of the SPG was ready in Chelyabinsk. On the 3rd of March, a meeting was held on the topic of improving the Kirovets 2. The main issue brought up was fitting the ML-20SM, originally built for the ISU-152, into the Kirovets 2. The gun had been sitting for quite a few months in a hole somewhere in Chelyabinsk. Other points discussed were further increasing the armor and thickening it from 100 to 150 millimeters. The traverse mechanism was altered and, most importantly, it was decided to give the Kirovets 2 a coaxial DSHK heavy machine gun, mounted on the right side of the main gun. The hull of the Kirovets 2 was ready in spring, but the gun was not mounted until halfway through June 1945. This delay was caused by bureaucratic disputes regarding serial production of the ML-20SM gun. The tank became the Object 704, yet the Kirovets 2 name stuck with factory workers. The design of the Kirovets 2 was unique, having little resemblance to previous Soviet heavy SPGs. It still had a frontal-mounted casemate where the turret and pike nose of the IS-3 used to be. Due to the aim to improve the armor protection to the same level of the IS-3, the armor plates were thickened and angled throughout the casemate. On the ISU-152, the gun mantlet was a large frontal weak spot, yet on the Object 704, it was the thickest part of the tank. Interesting to add is that the bottom of the side casemate angled inwards a lot more than it appears to. The almost flat triangle-shaped part of the side superstructure is actually just a thin sheet of metal. Although the IS-3 chassis was used, there were still some changes made. Namely, the engine plate was different and the exhaust pipe layout was the same as on the Object 701. It is unclear if this was done to save pieces for the production of the IS-3 or it was intentionally designed as such. An additional small construction detail is the use of several track types, satisfactory for a prototype built in a short period of time. There were 86 tracks per side, each track was 650mm wide and they were connected by a single pin each. The engine was the same V2IS engine, producing 520 horsepower, and the running gear and transmission were kept the same. The transmission was a multi-disc dry friction clutch. The gearbox was a 4+1 dual-stage manual, for a total of 8 gears forward and 2 reverse. The brakes were still planetary rotation mechanisms. Despite the external differences, inside, the Object 704 was very similar to the ISU-152. It still had a crew of 5, driver, gunner, commander, loader, and breech operator. The heavily angled sidewalls caused major internal ergonomic problems, namely storage for the huge 2-part ammunition, which weighed 49 kilograms for the armor-piercing and 44 kilograms for the high explosive. No easy task to load in a tight space. Sacrificing crew comfort and ergonomics for protection was quite common in late war and post-war Soviet tank doctrine. The vehicle's silhouette was much shorter than that of the ISU-152, now being only 2,240mm tall, but kept the same width. The modernized ML-20SM lacked a muzzle brake, which improved the visibility and kicked up less dust after firing. However, the recoil grew considerably, namely by 900mm, so a recoil brake was added. The gun had plus 18 degrees of gun elevation and a shockingly poor minus 1.45 degrees of depression. Horizontal traverse was not much better, at a very limited total of just 11 degrees. The gun could hit a 2.5 to 3 meter tall target reliably from 800 to 1000 meters, but had a direct fire range of 3.8 kilometers and an indirect fire range of 13 kilometers. Practical rate of fire is contradicting and ranges from 1 to a bit under 3 rounds a minute. A quick reload was not necessary for such a self-propelled gun, especially considering the terrible ammunition count inside the Kurovets II, just 20 rounds. These were placed on both side walls of the fighting compartment, and the charges were placed on the right wall and underneath the breech. The vehicle was equipped with two 12.7mm Dushka heavy machine guns, one coaxially mounted and one on the roof, with 300 spare rounds of ammunition inside. There was a chute for the ammunition belt to slide over the main gun and into the machine gun. The roof-mounted Dushka was for anti-aircraft use and was mounted on a rotating ring over the loader's hatch. The ring could swivel over and next to the hatch. The machine gun itself could also pivot on its mount. A collimating K-10T sight was mounted on the gun for easier aiming against aircraft. For the defense of the 5 crew members, they were equipped with PPSH or PPS submachine guns. Some F1 grenades could also be mounted on the sidewall between the commander and breech operator. The driver was located higher up in the hull than in the ISU-152 by 60 to 70 centimeters. Consequently, he did not have his own hatch in the front plate. Instead, his vision relied on the single movable Mk4 periscope in his hatch on the roof. As could be anticipated by such an arrangement, this was not enough, giving the driver rather poor vision when buttoned up. He was, however, also able to open the hatch and stick his head out in non-lethal environments. To control the tank, he had 2 mechanical tillers. On a good note, the driver no longer sat next to a large fuel tank like on the ISU-152, which was definitely good for morale. The gunner sat behind and to the right of the driver, on a seat attached directly to the gun. There he had the elevation control hand crank, as well as the trigger, his Hertz panoramic sight, and the by 2.5 magnification TSH-17 sight. This sight was adequate for firing up to 1,500 meters. Both sights were illuminated for conducting nocturnal firing. Directly under the breech block was a floor-mounted escape hatch for a total of 6 hatches. The commander was on the opposite side of the driver, also having just one Mk4 periscope for external vision. He was responsible for the radio placed right in front of him on the frontal armor plate. The coaxial machine gun was also his responsibility, most likely having to fire it as well. Yet the traverse of the main gun was controlled by the breech operator and elevation by the gunner, so aiming would have been a coordination challenge. Handling the massive shells was done by the loader. The shells were stacked on the side walls. He was also assigned operation of the anti-air Dushka on top of his hatch. To aid him in loading, he had a loading tray attached to the gun. A round would be rested on it until it was ready to load again. This meant that the loader did not have to hold the round until the breech was open again, a little but crucial detail considering the round's weight. There were 12 rounds on the wall next to him, while the other 7 were on the other side by the breech operator and were challenged to extract. Perhaps the most curious crew member position is the breech operator. It is important to note that the breech design was quite ancient and could not open automatically. The breech operator would open the breech while the loader was manhandling the rounds into the gun. Then he would close it. He could assist the loader with charge amounts as well. This was done to decrease the strain on the loader, as it was no easy feat. While testing reports were quite satisfied with the positions of the crew, a few issues were brought up. The angled sidewalls made storage of ammunition complex, and accessing them was cumbersome, let alone moving them out and into the gun considering their weight. The elevation of the driver's position also brought drawbacks, namely he would move a lot when the tank was moving on poor terrain. To boost morale and improve living conditions, 2 fans were placed behind the gun to ventilate and remove toxic fumes, as well as a couple of dome lights. As aforementioned, the engine was a V2IS outputting 520 horsepower. In cold winters, 2 compressed air cylinders were used to start the engine. A total of 3 fuel tanks were in the vehicle, 2 in the fighting compartment and 1 in the engine bay, for a total of 540 liters. 2 external fuel tanks were on the engine deck. These were not connected to the fuel system and were meant to be dismounted when entering battle. The engine allowed the tank to reach a top speed of 37 to 40 km per hour. The maximum range was around 180 km. Protection was one of the main focuses of the Object 704 project. All the armored plates were welded with heavy sloping all around the casemate. The front plate was 120 mm thick, angled at 50 degrees. The lower plate was 100 mm angled at -55 degrees. The mantlet had 2 layers of rounded 100 mm cast armor. The side was 90 mm angled at 15 degrees. Even the rear casemate armor was 80 mm at 21 degrees. The tank was immune from the front to the 88 mm Pak 43 L71 gun of the Tiger II, which it never got to fight. Despite this thick armor, the vehicle still had an acceptable weight of 47.3 tons. The SPG was finished by mid-June of 1945. It was sent to the Moscow factory number 37, from where it was taken to the state proving grounds at Kubinka. Originally, testers noted that the fighting compartment was cramped, but later changed to praises for the commander's and driver's stations and their placement. The People's Commissariat of Armaments asked to move the Object 704 to the Leningrad Artillery Research Experiment Range to test the gun and artillery capabilities. Despite this, the vehicle was still sitting in Kubinka. A test program letter for the ML-20SM was also sent in July 1945. It was only in August when tests were approved, but only began by September because factory number 172 engineers did not arrive at the testing grounds. They finally arrived by 24th of September, only to leave a few days later, leaving behind only an engineer which did not have authorization for any testing work. This outright comical timeline of bureaucracy delayed the testing of the Object 704 by 6 months. By 13th of November, Kuznetsov and chief designer Nazarov finally arrived from plant number 172. Testing was done from October until 13th of November, through which 65 shots were fired for indirect fire and 244 shots for direct fire. Several interesting remarks were made in relation to the superstructure and the design of the fighting compartment. The gun mantlet had no access port for the much needed recoil brake. This meant that measuring the hydraulic fluid and releasing air was impossible. The hole below the gun mantlet accumulated water. The sloping on the side walls made stowing ammunition difficult and complicating. Making the walls vertical was suggested. The commander's position was praised. It was put facing forwards and the new hatch made battlefield observation easier and more effective. Both the gunner's and driver's stations were praised and deemed as an improvement over previous heavy SPGs. The loader's position was actually considered spacious. The report stated that taking out the 12 rounds next to him could be done with ease. However, the 8 rounds on the opposite wall were noted to be hard to reach and load. In contrast, the breech operator's station was noted to be cramped, especially when the gun was traversed to the left, bringing the breech to the right. Extracting the 16 propellant charges on the right side of the tank was not ideal due to the tight space. The other 4 charges beneath the gun were impossible to take out in combat conditions. The Object 704 had clear advantages over the ISU-152. These included the lack of a muzzle brake, improved protection, and position of the driver and commander. The issues that were found could and most likely would have been addressed if it would have entered production. The tank's entry into service was hindered by bureaucracy and failure to get it to testing. The loss of time meant that the IS-4 was nearing serial production, making the IS-3 and an SPG based on it obsolete. With hindsight, the story of the IS-4 is arguably even worse. Another heavy self-propelled gun would not be built until the Object 268, based on the T-10, which had a similar fate to the Object 704. That's all for this video. Make sure to follow our website, we'll be releasing new articles on the regular. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or Reddit, and if you use Discord, there's a link to our community server in the description. That the breech design was quite ancient. I can't say ancient. Well, I do understand why I can't say ancient. It has nothing to do with how it's written.